just in a sort of a quick response, what's the Bible? What is it? It's a book?
It's a
Collection of writings, okay. What's the Bible? Here, every Sunday, we almost every Sunday, we read from it, don't we? Why? Why? Well, to connect ourselves with the past, but more than that. We call the Bible, what's the word we use for it? The sacred. Well, what makes it sacred? Uh-oh. Now, you weren't supposed to be laughing yet. What makes it sacred? Well, actually, even I can ask this. What makes anything sacred? This is a tough question. I don't mean to. We do. Something is sacred because we believe it is, because we treat it as such. And whenever we say something is sacred, it means to us anyway that somehow it's got a connection to the source of being, God. Okay, the Bible. How many of you have read it? The whole thing? Have you? Okay, good. Okay. What are some single words you can tell me about that Bible to describe it? Okay, I'll throw out a few. Contradictory, isn't it? Isn't it? Outright untrue, some of it. I mean, you have certain books, I think 1 and 2 Kings and 1 and 2 Chronicles, that have different nations winning the same war. There's a problem with that, you know? The Bible is a collection of books, writings, whatever we should say, that had been held sacred by Jewish people for a long, long, long time. They believed that they told the story of their own history. They told the story of God's relation to them and their relation to God. They gave the law, which was a way of living faithfully. And even what we now call the New Testament, you realize, was written by Jews for Jews. So it's a very Jewish book. How many of you ever realized that? Did you ever think about that? It's important. It really is, because it's also written by people in what we now call a pre-scientific era. That's because we think it's better to be a scientific era. That's what we think we're in. But we think that we go after facts, don't we? And we try to put together stories based on facts. Give me the facts. That's who we are. That is not who they were. They had a different way of recording history, a different way of saying the way things were. We now call that myth, M-Y-T-H. Ever heard of that word? Yeah. I'll bet you think a myth is a fairy tale. How many of you think that's sort of what a myth is? Like a fairy tale or just a cute little story? Not for the people of the days in which those writings were held sacred. A myth is a story that tries to get at the truth that lies beyond the mere facts of a situation. A myth is told because understanding the world and the way the story is told brings us to God. That's what the Bible is. But who said those are the right books? Do you know the answer to that? Did you ever wonder about that? How did it get there? Why are these the sacred writings? Let's be honest. Now, I want to see an honest answer to this. You don't just raise your hand if you can say yes to this. If you were in charge of putting together a book of sacred writings, would you choose the ones in the Bible? Nobody's raising their hand. So the answer is no, isn't it? Why wouldn't you choose them? Because they aren't your stories. Huh? Is that why? Let's say that it would be possible, and it's not, I'm telling you right offhand, it's not, for there to be a convocation of all the Judeo-Christian believers in the world for the purpose of putting together a new sacred scripture. Now, you know that's not going to happen. But that's how the Bible right now happened. Way back in the Council of Trent, way back when there was only one church. They got together and decided these are the books that are sacred, everything else is not. And that's who gave us this Bible. But isn't it kind of interesting to think of what would we call our sacred scriptures today? There's at least one person going there. It fascinates me to think of what that would include. What are some of the writings that any of you, there's no wrong answers to this, would want to include in a new Bible? What would those writings be? Maybe Gandhi? Did you ever read anything from Gandhi? Amazing, amazing person. Who? Gabriel Gibran. Isn't that how you say it? We all know who he is. We've gone to weddings. We go to weddings. No, really, good. Who? Paul Ramsey, the great ethicist. Yeah. Who? Mother Teresa. Boy, she was a cynic. She was, yeah. Who else? Reverend King. Reverend King. How about the young people? Who would you want in that sacred scripture? Or, okay, at least in the hymnal, huh? Yeah. Who would you want?
How about St. Augustine, Martin Luther, and John Wesley?
Yeah, because they're still old. For most of us didn't know them personally, you know. But they really, here I stand, I can do no other. And Martin Luther got thrown out of the church he wanted to stay in.
Thich Nhat Hanh.
Who?
Thich Nhat Hanh.
Okay. Think of that. Those really are writings that we already hold sacred. Do you understand that? They inspire us. That's why we're saying those things now. They inspire us. They open us up. We believe they connect us to the ground of being that we call God. I want to suggest that at least for those of us who are American Christians, many of the writings of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would have to be included as prophetic writings. A brilliant man. He was the son, grandson, and great-grandson of preachers, of ordained ministers, who had no intention of going into the church. He had his PhD in philosophy. He was going to teach. He was going to teach. Until he was sort of drafted, he believed by his people and by the people he admired in ministry and by God and by Jesus to become one of the most important leaders of a civil rights movement in the history of the world. He did. One of the times when he was leading marches early in the civil rights movement, I remember this. He was arrested along with hundreds of other marchers and put into the Birmingham, Alabama jail. Now, that is not a nice place, especially if you were a black man in those days, especially if you were a black man named Martin Luther King Jr. It was an awful place. And believe it or not, it was catching the nation's attention back then. While Martin Luther King Jr. was in jail, he received a letter from a bunch of white clergymen. It's important. They were all white-skinned clergymen who said how much they supported the aims of the movement but did didn't he think it was wrong to cause so much tension? Didn't he think that maybe they just needed to wait and give the new city administration time to change things? Of course, that city administration had run on a segregation platform. Didn't he think that violence was being caused by the peaceful protest movement that he was leading? Martin Luther King was not easily angered. In fact, he wasn't very good at it, being angry. But while he was in that jail in response to that letter from those white clergy, he wrote what was to become the longest letter he would ever write in his entire life. It's called now, because it's been published all over the place, The Letter from Birmingham Jail. How many of you have ever read that? Good. Anybody else? Please read it. The whole thing. I'm not about to read the whole thing this morning. It's a very long letter. I'm only going to read 2 excerpts from it. Here we are, this congregation in Lowell, Michigan. I'm excited, I hope the rest of you are, in this period of new beginnings, becoming a new people, having a new reason for being, out there in the community, doing the work of Christ, giving new life to people. We're going to be doing all this. There's a chance that we might not know how to empathize. We're going to talk about that word later. Empathize with many of the people that will benefit from any ministries we might do. Listen to what Martin Luther King Jr. wrote to those white clergymen from the Birmingham jail. Again, these are just 2 short excerpts. I must make some honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. And then in a later portion of that letter, he wrote this. There was a time when the church was very powerful, in the time when the early Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Whenever the early Christians entered a town, the people in power became disturbed and immediately sought to convict the Christians for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But the Christians pressed on in the conviction that they were a colony of heaven, called to obey God rather than man. Small in number, they were big in commitment. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. By their effort and example, they brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contests. Things are different now. So often the contemporary church is a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. So often, it is an arch defender of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silent and often even vocal sanction of things as they are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. Here ends what I believe was a sacred reading. May God bless its meaning to our hearts and our minds. The call to worship that we shared this morning was part of a liturgy, a book of liturgy that was written by a mega church of the United Church of Christ. There's only about one or two of those in the world, the United Church of Christ mega church. But it's on the south side of Chicago. The minister there, great preacher. I got to hear him a few times. He used to run seminars for clergy, and he preferred they be white clergy, about how to preach the word with firmness and about justice and things like that. And I got to go to one years and years ago, and Jeremiah was good. That was his first name. Anyway, he would tell us the story of how every year he believed that we white clergy, as Easter approached, had to wrestle with how could we get our people to really get into the meaning of Good Friday. Now, you know that Good Friday is the day that Jesus was crucified. He died and he was buried. He said, I know what you're going through. It's so much easier, he said, in the black church, because all those people have had to bear their crosses. All those people face some sort of crucifixion every day. So in the black church, we get to Easter a lot more successfully than do you folks in the white church. What was he saying? Do you understand what Jeremiah was trying to say to us? He's right. He's right. I don't see a non-white face here. And that's not a judgment. It's just the case. Okay. How many of you have ever stayed in a hotel or a motel? Have you? Okay. And when you went to register, did you ever worry that they would be filled up because of the color of your skin? Didn't you? Why? Why? Because your skin's white. Because your skin's white. Every time a black person in this country does that, the thought has to go through their mind, I wonder where else I could stay if they tell me they're full. That's still true today. Not as true. It's still true today because there's something they have no control over. Two things, actually. The color of their skin and the way the person behind the counter chooses to react to that. Now, you know what that example I'm talking about is called in sociological terms? White privilege. How many of you knew you have that? Did you ever think of it? You've done some anti-racism work. Yeah. Anybody over here, did you know you have white privilege? How do you know that? Where'd you learn it? History books? Boy, I hope some of them talk about that because I haven't seen one yet. Maybe you have some good teachers, honest teachers. But how many people here think maybe I'm a racist? It's okay if you don't, because you probably aren't. You probably are not. But how would you like to find out that you participate in racism every day? How would you like to find that out? If you found that out, let me say this. Would you want to change that? If you found out that every day of your life here you participate in racism, would you want to change that? Honestly, would you? Okay, you do. You do. It's called white privilege. It's also called institutional racism. Think about this, please. Remember the thing about affirmative action? It's pretty much died away now. How many of you read about it, heard about it? Do you even know what it was? What was it? It was really a system for companies that employed people to have to look at themselves. And if their workforce did not reflect the sociological makeup of the town or the area around them, they were forced to look at themselves and ask why. A lot of people, especially white people, derided these efforts to make the workforce more diverse by saying it's giving jobs to people that can't do the jobs. Absolutely not. So here's the hypothetical I want you to think about. You. I don't care who you are. You are the hiring director of a company. Your company is an industrial company that makes high precision parts. So you have to have people that work for you that can run drill presses and lathes and all kinds of things, and automatic welders. Okay, you got the sense. That's who you are. Even if you don't know anything I'm saying, that's who you are. And you've put out an advertisement in all the papers about you need skilled workers for this position, this position, this position, this position. You can hire 7 people. And after you get all the resumes back, you find out you got way more people than you need to fill the 7 slots. Okay? And you know that the only people you're going to call in for the face-to-face interview are people that can do the job. No question about it. Okay, you got that? Okay. Now remember, you're doing the interview. One of the persons that comes in is a woman who speaks English but with a very heavy accent. One of the people who comes in is a great big black guy. Another person who comes in reminds you of your neighbor down the street. Oh, did I forget to tell you that you grew up your entire life with only white people? I forgot to tell you that. I probably didn't have to. You find out from your face-to-face interviews with about 14 people for the 7 positions you have that every one of them can do the job. Who do you think you're going to hire? This is not necessarily, but this is just human nature. This isn't racism. You're going to hire the ones you felt most comfortable with in the interview. Of course you are, because you know they can all do the job. And if you were raised in all-white ghettos your whole life, if you went to schools that were basically all white all the way through college, you're going to be most comfortable with people who, what? Are just like you. You think the big black guy has got an equal chance with all the other people, given human nature? You think the little woman who speaks English with a very strong accent, so you got to listen hard, is going to get hired? Probably not. And it doesn't take racism for that to happen. It takes human nature. That's what affirmative action was about. Who didn't like it? Who didn't like affirmative action? Come on, the answer's simple. Why? It did away with white privilege. That's the world in which we live. It's the world in which all the people out there live. Do you think that's right? Anybody think it's right? I don't mean correct in the sense that, yeah, that is the world. Is it okay? Is it just? Is it fair? Well, what do you think? Okay, I'm actually going to ask this question. What do you think Jesus would think about the situation? What do you think Jesus would think about the situation? What did he call the scribes and the Pharisees? Do you remember? He wasn't always a nice guy.
Hypocrites and a brood of vipers?
Vipers, yeah, that was the one I like to remember. Yeah. You brood of vipers, you're hypocrites and all that. Who did he have meals with? And tax collectors. Oh boy, I mean, he wouldn't have made it in the American Revolution. Tax collectors, he had dinner with them. Boy, what's the point? You think Jesus would have thought that white privilege and the way it's used would have gone along with it? Hey, you know what? He wasn't white. Ever think of that? Well, yeah, he was very Jewish. Semitic is the sociological name. So all people who are Arabs and Jews from the Middle East anyway, they're swarthy, we call them, because they aren't white. Yeah. I love the pictures you see of the baby Jesus who was born in Florence, Italy. You know. You get it, don't you? Why does the baby Jesus look like a Caucasian baby? Because a Caucasian painted it. How do you think you would feel as a black kid, little black kid, whose parents say, we're Christians, and the only pictures you ever saw of Jesus made him look like he was born in Florence, Italy? How do you think you'd feel? Would you think, I want to be with him? Remember the paintings of the black Jesus? Now, they knew that they were no more legitimate portraits of Jesus than were the white ones, but the black parents knew they wanted their kids to be able to want to follow Jesus, and they weren't going to follow a little Italian kid. Okay? Are you getting what I'm trying to get at here? What's the word empathy? Anybody know the definition of empathy? It's different than compassion, or they wouldn't have two different words.
Sympathy with experience.
Well, sympathy is getting closer.
With experience.
Yeah, to feel the same way another feels. I didn't say think. To feel the same way another feels. What's the old saying about walk a mile in my moccasins before you criticize me? Because then you'll know what it's like to be in my moccasins. We are going to have trouble, my people, turning the world around. We're going to have trouble serving people who are needy and giving ourselves to them so that they might live, because we will not have empathy. We won't. We haven't been in their shoes. We haven't had to look down at the floor every time we talk to somebody that has things because we feel insignificant. We don't feel equal to them. We've got to have handouts all the time, and we know people resent it, or they feel good because they gave something to us. We've never had to go through that. Does it mean that we have to stop our ministries? It means that Martin Luther King, in that letter from the Birmingham jail, the parts of it that were directed at we who are the whites in the churches, we need to take it very seriously. That if we're going to turn things around in this country where we become so eminently ignorable that we might as well not be here, if we're going to turn things around because we're out there changing lives, we're maybe challenging the power structure, we can't look for comfort. We can't look for easiness. We cannot expect to be glad-handed and slapped on the back every place we go, either by those who are trying to lift out of poverty or by those who don't like the looks of things changing. resurrection of the Christian church will take many, many forms. The one that's going to be the hardest, because we have so much to change and therefore lose, is the resurrection of the white church. That's who we are. I wish that the letter from Birmingham jail was part of what we read on a regular basis and call it sacred scripture in the churches, because it speaks to us a word of the Creator who says the way things are is not good. The way things may be, if you follow in the way of Christ, will become. Those with ears to hear, let them hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.